I think hold on there. I just need to click that. So welcome everybody. As Linda said, my name is Martina O'Leary and I'm Forces Data Protection Officer. So thank you for joining us this morning, just after Easter. I know everybody's really, really busy and children are on midterm and things like that. So I appreciate you joining us. What I'm going to, Linda's already gone through housekeeping, but just to say that this session is being recorded. If you want to turn off your camera, that's not a problem at all, and we will have you on mute. I have this session divided into three sessions really for the training. I beg your pardon now, just for some reason now, there you are. I have this morning divided into three sessions. So this morning will be an introduction, and then I'm going to cover data protection legislation. Then we're going to have a break at 11:15 for 20 minutes. And then I'm going to cover probably what a lot of you are here for is, as branch officers and as FORSA reps, what we expect you to do and ask you not to do. And at the end of each session, I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a question and answers where Owen Ronayne, our Deputy General Secretary, who has overall responsibility for data protection, will help with the questions as well. I would ask you, in terms of the questions, to keep them relevant to the session that we're doing, please. And then the last session, which starts at 12:15, is around data breaches and data subject rights, and then a sort of a quick summary of what we have done so far today. So again, thank you for joining us. For anyone that's just coming in now, just a reminder that this is being recorded, and you're welcome to turn off your video if you wish. Please put your questions through the chat and we will get to them at the end of each session. So I suppose to just work away, and just to say, in terms of this session, GDPR in some ways can be quite complex, and so I'm just touching this morning what we need to know in terms of the GDPR. There's also the Data Protection Act and other legislations as well, which I won't really be going into. So it's just, as FORSA reps, the information you need is what I'm dealing with this morning. There's things like, third-party transfers and all that type of stuff that I will not be touching. So just that you're aware of that you're not getting a comprehensive guide in relation to data protection. So, almost 4 years ago now, data protection, the GDPR came in, and there is, and people get afraid and get fearful when they hear about data protection. It's like me, when someone mentions pensions, I just cloud over. Well, GDPR, the mention of GDPR has the same effect on some people. But if you sort of listen to this morning, a lot of it is common sense. And it is important. You as branch officers and as branch reps will be handling members' information. So we do have an obligation to protect that information, to keep it secure, to keep it confidential, and to make sure that only the people who should have access to that information have access to that information. And it is important. And just to say, in relation to GDPR, although it came into force in May 2018, there has been previous legislation there since World War II, really, and there have, the new bit is accountability, which I will speak about later on. But it's also important to know, even though it is the law, it's also a human right. And I think if you get your head around that if you share your information with somebody, an organization, you want to know that information is being used for the reason you gave it to that organization in the first place, and it's not being used for anything else, and that it's been kept confidential, and it's been kept secure, and only the people that you think are looking at it are actually looking at it. Again, in terms of data protection, the reason the EU brought in this new legislation is that the world of work has changed so much. When I started working over 30 years ago, I had a manual typewriter, or electronic typewriter, and I thought I was the bee's knees. Now we have the internet. Now we just share data and information in such a different way and in such a quick way that there needs to be protections there. And just to say, this is a principles-based piece of legislation. And the reason it's structured like that is because If the legislation started to recommend different technologies and things like that, technology changes so quickly that it will very, very quickly become obsolete and become out of date. And that's why it's a principles piece of legislation. And just to sort of dive straight into it, what is personal data? And personal data, as defined by the Data Protection Act, the Irish Data Protection Act, is data relating to a living individual who can be identified either from the data alone or from the data in conjunction with other information that is in or is likely to come into the possession of the data controller. So the first part of that is very obvious. You know, if you're named in a piece of information or your address or your email address, well, then that's your personal data. But sometimes it's not as simple as that. Sometimes it could be the data protection officer with Forsa who lives in Clondalkin and is a member of Round Towers GAA club. You can piece that information together and all of a sudden you know exactly who it is. It's Martina O'Leary from Forsa. So that is the definition of personal data. So as a Forsa rep or as a Forsa branch officer, what type of information are you dealing with? And there could be many things. Some of you will be dealing with, if you deal with cases, some of you may be dealing with, you know, a member's case file. So that would be employment records. A lot of you may be dealing with application forms now. A lot of our applications are done online now, but still some of you deal with application forms. They are like gold dust and they need to be treated with the utmost of respect because there is so much information in them. You're talking about members' names, their date of birth, their occupations, their home addresses. There's an awful lot of information there, so they really need to be kept secure. Then other types of personal data that we deal with are emails, you know, sometimes telephone calls, financial information, with medical records, CCTV images, and IP addresses. And just to say, there's a thing called special categories of personal data. And I suppose I'll read it to you first so you can read it there yourselves. And just to say that trade unions is part of the special category of data. And that puts extra responsibilities in terms of keeping that information safe and secure on Forsa and on you as branch rep. So it's really, really important that we keep this information safe. And I've been asked in the past, why are there special categories of information? And if you read the categories there, so it's personal data revealing to race, racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, data concerning health, sex life, sexual orientation, genetic data or biometric data. So as a trade union, we're automatically in special categories of data. But if you're representing a member, particularly what we've just gone through in the past 2 years in terms of COVID-19, you could be dealing with somebody's medical records. You know, if you're dealing with a bullying case, it could be around sexual orientation, it could be around their ethnic origins, you know, so very quickly you could be dealing with more than one, possibly 2 or 3 categories of special data. And so you just need to be very, very aware of that. And I'm going to do some definitions here, because you will hear, you know, if you're dealing with data protection, you will hear some of these terms. So data controller, in relation to Forsa, Forsa is the data controller. And to put it very simply, the controller decides what happens with the information. Okay, so they decide how the information is processed. A data processor will be generally a third party. So say, for instance, Forsa would use ERS, there are computer company that would give us computer advice and computer services. So they will be a processor. Forsa, as the controller, would direct the processor in terms of how they should deal with the information. Pseudonymization is it's something that we can use sometimes and is recommended sometimes in the GDPR, and that's sort of partial anonymizing information to keep it secure. The data subject, which is an unfortunate term, I think, but a data subject is you, it's me, it's Forsa members. and it's referred to a lot within the legislation. Personal data, we've just done the definition of. DPO is the data protection officer, so that's my role, and many organisations, including Forza, are obliged to have a data protection officer, particularly because we have a lot of special categories of members. And the DPC is the Data Protection Commission. So the Data Protection Commission is the regulatory authority within Ireland, and that ensures that people comply with the data, with the GDPR. And just to say, there's this facility within the legislation, and it's called One Stop Shop. I'm sure you're all aware of this. So that if there are big organizations like Google's and Twitter's and Facebook's of the world, instead of them having to report to every single regulatory authority within the EU, where they're based is the authority that they deal with. And because so many of them are based within Ireland, our Data Protection Commission deal a lot with Facebook's, Twitter's, and the big tech companies within the world. And you will have seen some of the cases and some of the media coverage around that, but it's just important to recognize that. Now let's see. So what is data processing? And you know, we all think it's obvious what data processing is, but sometimes it's not. Excuse me, just gonna have a drink of water. I had a situation there a few weeks ago where a member of staff was saying, sure, it's no big deal, they're just looking at the information. And I said, yeah, well, because they're looking at the information, you're sharing the information with them. So they are processing the information. So we do need to take certain steps. So processing is any operation performed on personal data. That's excluding personal and household activities. So it's the collection, recording, the organization, the structuring, the storage, the use, dissemination, or otherwise making available, erasure or destruction. So it's from the start of the life of a piece of information, personal data, that you have it, and you decide how long you're going to keep it for until it's erased or till it's destructed securely. That is processing information. Once it's in some form of a structured filing system, that is considered processing, you know. So even though you might have it in your filing system and you haven't looked at it in years, you're still processing that information. So you need to be aware of that. As I said already, the GDPR is a principles-based piece of legislation, and here you will see in this slide are all the principles. And just to run through them very quickly at first, there's lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. There's purpose limitations, there's data minimization, accuracy, storage limitations, integrity, and confidentiality. Now, all of those were present before the GDPR in some form. They have been strengthened. The new one is the accountability principle. And what this really means is that it's not good enough for Forza or any data controller to say, oh yeah, we have processes in place. Yeah, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. It's grand. We need to be able to prove, and we need to be able to demonstrate that we do have processes in place and that they're written down, that staff have been trained, and we need to be able to prove that. We need to have our training logs. Say, for instance, Forza would have, we use a company called Privacy Engine, and they give us this training platform to train staff. So I need to prove that I've trained staff. I need to be able to prove that I've trained branches and keep a record of the branches that I've trained. So it's all about demonstrating that you are compliant. There's a thing called the ROPA, which is a register of processing activities. So everything that we do in terms of members' information has to be included in this ROPA, and I need to be able to demonstrate that, how long we keep information for, all that type of thing. So I'm going to run through the principles one by one, but just to be aware of these, because everything goes back to these principles. And if you have a question in terms of, you know, you're about to do something with a member's piece of information and you're not sure, if you think of these questions or think of these principles, you can't go far wrong. So just, I suppose, first, in terms of the lawfulness of processing, and really this is so important, I describe this like a shopping list. There are several, you must have a lawful basis to process members' information, or as a data controller, if you're processing information, you have to have a lawful basis. Now, there are you will see here that the letters in there, the words in red, are the lawful basis. So it could be that the data subject has given consent. Okay, it could be necessary in the performance of a contract. So say, for instance, if you are taking a mortgage out with a bank and you're in a contract with your bank in terms of the mortgage, so they're processing your information because of a contract. It could be a legal obligation. So say, for instance, your employer has to deduct PRSI and tax and everything else from you, so they're obliged to do that. It could be in terms of the vital interest of a person. So if somebody is unable to give consent, so say someone is unconscious or is extremely ill, well, then it's in their vital interest to be able to process their data, and you can use that as a lawful basis. Again, for the public interest or official authority, or for legitimate interest of the data controller or third party. Forsa would use legitimate interest a lot, and I'll talk about that in a little while, just now, really, to be honest. Just to say, in terms of public service bodies, which most of you will work in a public service bodies cannot use legitimate interest as a lawful basis, but they will all have some sort of founding legislation that formed that organization, and that generally will be the lawful basis that a lot of public service organizations would use, just so that you're aware of that. So when you're processing information, you must have one of these. And then I've already mentioned in terms of special categories of data. So in terms of special categories of data, there is an additional shopping list, and it's a much longer list, and you must have one of these as well. So again, you must have either explicit consent. So say, for instance, to give an example of that, when members join Forsa, they give explicit consent for Forsa to share their information with the employer, so that we can facilitate and they can facilitate deduction at source, that we can take the subscriptions out of your wages. So you would give explicit consent there. There's also facility if again you give explicit consent to share your information with some insurance companies, core market and lines and things like that. Again, it has to be explicit consent. And around consent, it needs to be balanced, and it needs to be fair, so that there are issues around consent. Again, in terms, it can be employment and social security and social protection, again in the vital interests of the data subject or others. And we would use the next one a lot. It's processing that's carried out in the course of legitimate activities with appropriate safeguards by a foundation, association, or any other non-profit seeking body with a political, philosophical, religious, or trade union aim. That's a mouthful. It's basically legitimate interest in relation to trade unions, okay? And we would use that a lot. And again, if you think of it, and I will probably say this a number of times today, but if you think of it as in terms of the issue of membership lists comes up a lot. Does a branch officer or does a union rep have the right to have access to a branch list? And the question, the way I look at it, and I take a very simple approach to this, as a branch officer, if you're trying to communicate with your members, how can you do that if you do not know, or how can you represent your members if you do not know who your members are? Okay, so you have a lawful basis, in this instance, legitimate interest, to have access to that list. Okay, now if you're a rep within the branch and you represent just a small section of that branch, well, you're only entitled to the list within the workplace that you represent, not the full branch. Again, it's all about the lawful basis. Other reasons in terms of special categories, personal data may be made public by the data subject. That might be a celebrity who's spoken about something personal within the media. Well, then, you know, they've already put it out there. It could be necessary for the establishment, exercise and defence of legal claims, and again, substantial public interest. And the rest here are in relation to preventative or occupational medicine or public interest in the area of public health. And, you know, with COVID-19, the government would have used those as lawful basis a lot. And again, archiving purposes in the public interest. Again, it's really, really important that you have one of these if you're dealing with special categories of data. So just in terms then, the next principle is the one of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And really what this is about is telling people how you are using their information, and that it's done fairly as well. So consent is given freely, and that everybody knows I'm sharing my information with you, and I know what you're going to do with it. I know who has access to it. I know how long you're going to keep it for, and I know what you're going to do with my information. So it's about being transparent. It's about being fair. And we would have a thing called a fair processing notice. So say, for instance, you're doing a survey. Well, you will notice at the end of each survey that there's a little note to say we're using your information for, and you need to do that. Forsa would have a privacy notice. We have that on our website, and that's a living document that changes all the time in terms of, you know, if we introduce a new system or something like that, then the privacy notice should reflect that, and it tells members how we process their information. And a question came in when you were asked what subjects you were asked if you're interested in. A question came in around CCTV. So this is a good example. So say you go into an organization, there'll be a little sign to say we use CCTV here, and it'll tell you why they're using it. So, well, it should tell you why they're using it, whether it's because of health and safety and security. So if they can't really go beyond that use, if that's what the notice says. Okay, so some employers have tried. So it's important that you're upfront in relation to what you're doing with persons' information, and you need to avoid going beyond that. And this is where the principle of purpose limitation comes in. And I have the can of paint there. So you need to avoid mission creep. It's what it's called. So you only use the information for the purpose it was obtained. So you only do what it says on the can. And you need to avoid mission creep as much as possible. So in terms of you as Forsa reps, you only use the information you have for union business, because that's why you have the information. You don't use it for any other reason, only union business. So data minimization is the next principle. So you only collect and keep the information that you require. And you know, in terms of collecting information, say for instance, a member of staff wants to do a survey, well, I will look at that, and I will sort of ask them critical questions. Well, why are you asking that question? And if they can give me a good operational reason as to why they need that information, I'd say that's absolutely fine. But if they can't, it's just in case, that it might be nice to have. That's not good enough. You can't collect that information. You really need to have a good reason as to why you're collecting people's personal data. And so you need to have a good, strong operational reason as to why you would collect information. So other principles which are obvious, really, you know, accuracy. So we have an obligation to keep our information accurate, and this is where you would come in as branch reps to encourage members to, if they move home or if they change any of their contact details, to let us know. We're not mind readers, you know, so if they don't let us know, or you don't let us know that someone's contact details have changed, well, then we can't contact them, and that is an issue if a ballot comes up, or just generally you want to be in contact with our members, you know. So it is important that we try and keep that information as accurate as possible, and Force is obliged to have processes in place to ensure that we do try and keep the information accurate. Storage limitations, that's again how long you keep information for. I'm going to talk a little bit about data retention later, so I'll mention that later. And again, in terms of integrity and confidentiality, and this is really probably the core responsibility for a lot of us. So if we have information, whether it be on hard file or hard format or soft copy, we need to, one, make sure that no one else has access to it. It's kept confidential, and only the people who need to have access to it have access to it. And if you walk into the Force of buildings or any of your buildings, I'm sure, you know, you're not going to be able to walk in the front door and straight up the stairs. There's going to be some sort of check. We have card access into, it will be initiated to live soon, and into all sort of the main areas within the offices. You need to have a card, and to use a photocopier, you need to have a card, you know. So there's all sorts of securities and stops to ensure the information is kept confidential. And then in terms of accountability principle, this is the new principle, I've already referred to this. So we need to be able to prove that we have systems and processes in place to make sure that the information is safe. I think I've mentioned everything there that I need to mention. Let me see. Yeah. And in terms of accountability, I have mentioned already that the logs that I would keep. So say, for instance, there's a data breach, I will have to log that into one of our registers. If there's an incident, I need to log that. I need to log all the training. So it's again proving all the time that you're working towards accountability, you're working towards keeping being compliant with data protection. So in terms of questions, I just wonder, I can't see the chat, so I'm just wonder if there's any
Martina,
questions.
I'm here.
Okay.
So, I have one or two come in there. So Colette says, very interesting. One problem I have found with GDPR is the lack of ease to contact other branch officers about issues we may have a mutual interest in. Is there a possible way around this? And I was actually just going to go back to Colette to clarify, did she mean her other branch officers on her branch executive or branch officers from other branches? It wasn't clear from the question.
I can address both. What I'll do is I'll address the second one first in terms of other officers. There's an issue, and this arises sometimes, particularly every second year when there are elections in May for divisional elections, and then this year when there are national elections taking place. And there's an issue around some candidates would like to be given a list of branch secretaries, of all branch secretaries, and we would not have a lawful basis to share that information. And just to be quite clear about this, we have had two outside experts come in, and these experts will be well known within data protection circles, would be on media and whatever a lot. We do not have a lawful basis. So say, for instance, you've got a branch secretary, the air traffic control branch secretary, and you have a candidate running from, let's see, probation and welfare in the civil service. We do not have a lawful basis to give the information of that air traffic control branch secretary to the candidate running. Okay, now what we have done is we've facilitated another way for candidates to get their information out there, and that's the process that we use. In terms of branches, a branch committee communicating with one another, and I will talk about in the next section in terms of how to, using BCC when you're sending mails and things like that. And I do recommend that we do try and keep that as tight as possible. But say, for instance, you have a small group who's trying to decide the time of a meeting, or you have to review a document and you have to review the feedback. Yeah, it's absolutely fine to, in those cases, use the to button when you're sending emails, and you'll see the email source. But generally, we need to keep it tight, and it's all going back to the lawful basis. Do we have a lawful basis to be sharing that information? Okay, and just as an example, where I worked in communications within Forza for a long time, and Impact before that, and we used to do the calendar. We used to have a branch secretary list within, the diary. We always had to get consent of people before we put their names and addresses, because in some cases it was their private address that was going into the diary, and if we didn't get consent, it didn't go into the diary. Okay, so again, it's that list. Remember that list I showed you earlier on in terms of what lawful basis you're using, and we need to have one of those. I hope that answers your question, Colette.
We have a few more coming in there now,
Okay.
Martina, so I'll
Yeah.
keep going through them. Colette actually had put a few in, and so another issue is keeping membership lists updated, and circulating information to members is proving more difficult.
Yeah, I suppose I'm dealing, I can address it. I'm not sure what the question means, but I am dealing with sort of membership lists and communicating with members in the next section. But again, I will talk about, when you're communicating, once, like, you are entitled to a branch list if you are a branch officer and you have a function in terms of communicating with members. How can you communicate with members if you don't have access to who your members are? So that's not a problem. But how you do that, so if you're emailing a large group of people, I really recommend that you use the BCC button, because we've all got emails where there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of email addresses up the top of the email. And in there somewhere, maybe 2 or 3 people who don't want their information shared, who don't want people to know they're a member of the union, and they're quite entitled to that, and we need to respect that. And that's what the legislation says. So we just need to be careful around that. Linda?
And then, Martina, just in relation to what you were saying there, we'd say particularly in relation to the election example, there's 2 messages in from different people, and it's the same vein, which is that if branch officers in other branches are willing to share their contact details with other branches, is there a way to facilitate this? And the point being made is that wider communication is key and creates a good bond. I think you've addressed that in terms of how we facilitate it as a union, but is there anything else you want to add there?
Like, I suppose consent is an alternative, and from experience, you may get consent from some, you will not get consent from all. Absolutely not. And the issue with consent as well is that it must be able to be withdrawn as easily as it is given. So there's all sorts of issues around consent, and in terms of that fairness as well. So where branches feel that they're obliged to give consent, because the balance of power could be perceived as being with Forza HQ. So there's a whole issue in terms of consent. And I referred to the advice that we got, and there's about 5 pages in relation to consent, just in terms of advice, so it can get quite complex and quite complicated.
Well, this is also a long enough question, so I'll try to do it justice. From
Okay.
Michael Collins in the Legal Professionals. The Data Protection Commissioner Office, on foot of a complaint regarding collection of data subject using CCTV, will disclose the complainant's name to the processor or data controller who is not compliant with GDPR rules. This is astonishing release of data by the very agency set up to protect data. And how can there be confidence in the competency of the DPC when it releases the name of a complainant to entity who is unlawfully collecting data? Now, that's a very specific question from Michael, and maybe you might want to come back on afterwards.
I can come back on, but just to say, in my dealings with the Data Protection Commission, if somebody puts a complaint in relation to Forza, in terms of how we processed or not processed a member's information, for me to handle that complaint, I need to know what the complaint is. I need to know who the person is so that I can investigate it, because otherwise I can't investigate it. So maybe, I'm not too sure in relation to the particular case you're referring to, Michael, but I think maybe that's the reason, because any time that I would deal with a complaint from the DPC, I might necessarily always see the original complaint. Sometimes they attach it, sometimes they don't. And if they don't, I will ask to see it, just because, one, in terms of when was the complaint lodged, because there are huge backlogs in terms of the DPC dealing with complaints. I've had complaints land on my desk recently that were lodged a year and a half ago, so that they can be very, very slow. And again, for me to investigate a complaint correctly and properly, I need to know who's involved.
So then, Martina, there's a few chats from a few different people that are all related to the same issue around SOLAS. And so somebody has talked about not all branches are given access to memberships. And then somebody has asked a question about, with the implementation of Solus, will all branch secretaries be issued a Force a Rep email address? And this might make it easier for branch officers to communicate. And somebody is supporting that idea around Solus and saying it would alert the union to the source of, trust, and that they'd know, members would know the singular source of emails within a branch. So I know this is in the presentation later on, but do you want to give a quick answer to it now?
Yeah, well, a quick answer, and Linda's correct, I am dealing with Solus and membership lists later on in the next session. But just to say, in terms of Solus, and in terms of access to Solus, we will be using forcearep.ie for a branch officer to have access to Solus. And just to clarify, in case people aren't aware of what Solus is, Forza has invested heavily in terms of human resources and financial resources in getting a new membership system in place. And it's sort of been launched in various phases, and phase 1 has just been launched. So that's just the transfer of members' data from 3 separate databases. So that would be the old PSEU, the old CPSU, and the old impact databases. And now all the information is merged into one. The membership system is called Solus. So that's what we're referring to. In stage 2, the plan is that branch officers, at the moment, I think it will be 1, but that will be extended. But branch officers will be able to view their system, their membership list within Solus. Now, obviously, there'll be 2-factor authentication will have to be used there, and 2FA, 2-factor authentication, at this stage is best practice. It's recognized as best practice, and really, it's probably standard practice at this stage. That's what it's becoming. To enter into most systems, you need 2FA. And to facilitate that, we're insisting that it's forcearep.ie. And you will appreciate, I spoke earlier about, we have an obligation to keep our members' information safe and secure. And if you think of a branch, some branches are quite small, some branches are huge. So if you take an S&A branch, there's probably about 2,000 members on that branch. So we have to keep that information secure. We have to have systems in place to make sure that those lists they're sacrosanct. There's so much information. It's your date of birth, it's where you live, it's where you work, and it's your email address. And if you pay, very few members do, but if you pay via direct debit, it could be your bank details as well. So, you can appreciate, and you would want us to make sure that your information is safe. So that's from a Solus perspective, how it'll work. In terms of the timescale for that, I'm not too sure what the timescale is. We're hoping summer, but because of the Easter break and that, and people are on leave for various reasons, we just need an update on that from the Solus team. In terms of the Force a Rep and the use of Force a Rep, and again, we will talk about this later, and I'm not sure if Owen wants to talk about this now or later, but just again, we would send out some sensitive information to branch secretary, generally branch secretaries. Once a month, it will be the new members who has applied to become a member of your branch. So again, that's very sensitive information, and we need to have to keep that secure. There are other issues in terms of employers having access to force information, but I think I'll leave that till the next session. Oh, do you want to come in now, or do you want to?
That was actually one of the next comments, was somebody was saying highlighting around the force addresses, that they can't be accessed through work systems. It has to be on a personal phone or laptop, and you commented on it there, and you've signposted we'll be talking about it later.
Yeah.
And so I might just move on then to the next question. So Marty Lynch is asking, is the branch secretary GDPR compliant when issuing a group email to inform members of events such as a ballot on national agreements or industrial action, and where the members' email addresses and names aren't shown, but just the relevant information is in the email.
If the members' email address is not seen, and it's, you know, no one is personally identified, that will be compliant. I'm going to deal with that in the next session. And just to, like, the first session was around the law as such, the next session will be in relation to what I need you as branch officers to do and not do. So it'll be about emails, about how to keep that information safe. So a lot of the questions you have now will be dealt with in the next session, particularly around, you know, sending emails, around access to membership lists, around forcerep.ie. So I hope I'm not fudging questions. They will be dealt with in the next session.
Perfect. Well, we're coming up. I see there are 2 more questions specifically about what you've just said there, Martina, around branch reps being on a group email and around the price of the Force Rep emails. So if you're happy enough to leave those till the next section, I think we're just coming up on a break, if my memory serves me correct.
Yeah, you're correct. So I think we take a break now, and I would ask everybody to be back sharp at 11:05, and that's when we will deal with, you know, what I need you to do as branch officers and Force Reps. It's about sending emails, it's about membership lists, and it's about forcerep.ie. And then again, the last session then after our break will be in relation to data breaches and data subject rights. So thank you for joining with me this morning, and go have a break, and we will see you sharp at 11:05. Thank you.